Thank you for joining us on the lightattheend.com podcast. Lightattheend.com is a resource for those who want to learn more about end-of-life topics but don't know where to start. I'm Kevin Berk, and I'm joined today by Jennifer A. O'Brien, healthcare executive, advocate, award-winning author, and artist. It's so good to be with you, Jennifer. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we got connected because I had done a podcast with Susan Hannafin McNabb, and she had recommended that I get in touch with you. And so in advance of connecting with you, I bought the two books, The Hospice Doctor's Widow and your newer one, Care Boss. We talked just briefly enough to know that we were going to cut this in half and only talk about one of them today, which is the Hospice Doctor's Widow, an art journal of caregiving and grief. Can you talk a little bit about what gave you your start?
Absolutely. So interestingly, my work as a self-taught artist has come out of the deaths of a couple of loved ones. My brother died when I was 18. He was 13. My mother died not quite 20 years later. And following both of those deaths, I found some comfort in exploring my artistic tendencies. Again, totally organically self-taught. It's not something I learned in school. But especially after I took my mother's ashes, she was cremated, up to where my brother is buried in northern New Mexico to scatter them. And after I did that, I attended this little workshop on what was called art journaling, which I didn't even really know what that was. And I loved it. And it really started me on a collage and assemblage type journey, if you will, many, many years ago, 21 years ago, almost 22, actually. Just putting stuff together, cutting stuff out and pasting it quite literally in the analog form, such that when my husband became ill with cancer, my mother had died of cancer, I turned to the art journaling just as a form of self-care. But the twist on it, when my late husband Bob got sick, was that I started to try digital collaging, which was quite the challenge. It was a kind of a perfect combination of head work and heart work, right? Because I knew what I wanted the computer to do and how I wanted it to look, but I wasn't 100% sure how to make it do that. And so it was this really wonderful combination of both those types of exercise, of work. I started the journaling almost instantaneously after Bob got the diagnosis. He was diagnosed with a renal clear cell carcinoma that was already metastatic and stage 4, just to document my thoughts, my feelings. And Bob was a hospice and palliative care physician. So I really wanted to document some of his wisdom and thoughts and feelings. Interestingly, I don't know that Bob knew I was doing the journal as I look back on it. I've been asked about that. He never saw any of it. So I don't think that he knew about it. But anyway, that's how my self-taught artistry came to be. I think just backing up a little bit, since I didn't know what an art journal was when I went to that first workshop, for your listeners, an art journal is kind of what it sounds like. You create art. Some people paint. I am not skilled at that, but I am skilled at collage. So I do collage, and then I write the journal notes kind of on top of the collage in most cases. And then there's some other pages that are stuck in there throughout that are the emails that I sent to our friends and family to update them on how Bob was doing. So the word that I continue to be hesitant to use is sort of is scrapbook. Like I inserted some things in this journal that I felt needed to be there for my sake, just to kind of have a sense of chronology and hit on topics that I felt were important to me to preserve.
How did the Hospice Doctor's Widow become something that that you published or wanted to publish?
Yeah, good question. So I have, as you mentioned in the introduction, I have been in healthcare my entire career, 36 plus years. I like to say I started when I was 12, but I didn't. Um, so I started the journal, as I said, right when Bob got the diagnosis, and I kept going with it. Of course, there was a period of time when Bob's care required such intensity that I couldn't get to the computer and do any digital collages. So I made notes in a traditional, like pen to paper kind of notes and pictures in a book. And then after he died, the journaling continued, got back to the computer and did the ones that I had sketched out. And then I also did a lot of grief work in the journal after he died. I took one of those interim leadership positions with a very large multi-specialty practice here in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where I live. And I had finished the journal. One of the physicians, a neurologist, told me one day about how he was in the process of diagnosing 3 different patients with ALS, which is a terminal diagnosis. And so I brought my journal in to him. He had known Bob and, knew our story a little bit, but I brought the journal in and he took it home that night. And he came back the next day and said, "Yeah, Jen, you're not getting your journal back. I will be loaning it to these 3 patients, moreover, to their spouses, because what you've documented there is something that will really help them in what's ahead of them for them. And if you could figure out how to get this thing published, I think it would really help a lot of people." There's a point in learning to carry one's grief that you turn a corner and the weight of the grief becomes light enough that you start to think, how might I help other people? I was at that corner when he said, "You need to figure out how to get this published because it could help some other people." So, I was just like, wow, okay, let me do that. And I found an independent publisher that was willing to take a chance on it because it is, as we've alluded to the book, it's 8 by 10, it's premium color, it's got a lot of art, a lot of picture. It's a picture book of sorts, but it's about caregiving, end of life, and grief. It's a atypical book, to say the least. There wasn't anything out like it, and dare I say, there has not been anything out since that's quite like it. But this small publisher took a chance, and it went out into the world, and it has indeed helped thousands of family caregivers with what is, the most difficult thing that we do for the people we love.
And you added on to it more recently with a second edition.
Yes. So I recently changed publishers as the second book came out, and then I reissued The Hospice Doctor's Widow as a second edition, and it has 3 big differences. The subtitle was augmented. It used to just be The Hospice Doctor's Widow, a journal. That was apparently confusing to people. So it is now called The Hospice Doctor's Widow, an art journal of caregiving and grief. It has a absolutely beautiful but short foreword written by Elizabeth Coplin, who is a Pulitzer nominee for a play she wrote and just an incredible, productive person in the space of Out of Grief Comes Art. And then there are 9 additional art journal entries at the very end of the book that are all after loss, grief processing type journal entries. And I think those have rounded it out nicely and made it a little bit more equal on the caregiving and the grief side of things.
Yeah, I agree. I was hoping that we could talk about some specific pages because I
Absolutely.
think that there's a lot that is very universal. There's a lot that's very profound. I feel like if we were to talk through all the pages that really struck a chord with me, we'd be talking and or showing or having you read half the book. So I'll keep it to some of my, I guess, favorites or ones that I think are have just really interesting talking points around them. Starting with the concept of precious time that you said was a phrase that your husband Bob used as a palliative and hospice care doctor.
Well, why don't I read the page and we'll start there.
Great.
Precious time. He has helped families understand by telling them they were into precious time, meaning death is likely, if not imminent. Precious time is when you say what you need to say and don't say what you will later regret. Now it is us. We are into precious time. He's going to die of this disease, and I will go on and have to live with how I handled our precious time. So, what's important, I think, about that is, first of all, he always put the emphasis on the first word. I'm a Yankee. He's a Southerner, or was a Southerner. I thought that was a Southern thing. Like, Southern people say insurance and umbrella. They put the emphasis sometimes on the first syllable or word. But that's not what it was. It was to distinguish that this is a distinct period of time. It comes at the end of life when death is coming. Bob and I both, Bob mostly from his professional experience, because he had very little personal experience with the death of loved ones, and me with my personal experience, felt really strongly that knowing that death is coming, as hard as it is to know this, is super important because there are no dress rehearsals, right? There's no do-over in the end of life of a loved one. And you go on and you have to live with how you handled it. And so his way of telling families that the end was coming, that the person they loved was dying, was to say, you're into precious time. And precious time is when you say what you need to say. Precious time is when you say your I love yous and your thank yous and your I'm sorries. And you don't say stuff that's going to open up a whole bunch of stuff that you can't resolve by the end of the person's life. That's why you stick to I'm sorry and that sort of thing. And I know that it was effective because he received thank you notes from surviving loved ones that thanked him for being forthright enough to share with them that this was coming when many other physicians and healthcare professionals are unwilling to say the end is coming. And so this was just this lovely way that he could communicate this. Everyone knew what it meant. It's not uncertain. And yet it's softer than your person's dying. And so precious time actually has become larger than the book itself in some ways, certainly within the healthcare community. It's a method that is now used by lots of nurses and doctors to try to communicate this. Not as many as I would like, because there are still many professionals who are unwilling to be as forthright about end of life as families really need them to be.
Yeah, that was one of the conversations. In fact, the first podcast I did with Dr. Jeffrey Stoneberg, who was a medical director for palliative care, had said that in his experience, so many people, whether it was the doctors didn't want to give bad news or just were speaking over their heads or something, so many people and their families would go on to hospice care and really didn't understand what that meant and were saying, "Oh, okay, well, how long will they be on hospice before they can go?" And it's like somebody hasn't prepped you properly by talking to you about what this actually means.
Yeah. Hospice is a prognosis that you will die within 6 months or less. But what's interesting about hospice is the average length of stay on hospice is only 91 days. We are not, as a society and in healthcare, we typically refer patients to hospice later than they would benefit from. For cancer patients, the average length of stay, depending on the study that you read, is either 17 or 19 days. So even when someone understands that, when a family understands that hospice is end of life, they frequently think, oh, I've got 6 months. And you don't have necessarily 6 months. You might
Mhm.
have 6 months. You might have longer than 6 months. But the average length of stay for cancer is about 3 weeks. and for other illnesses is about 3 months. And so, yeah, that's an important issue to know. The other thing that I think a lot of professionals in healthcare mix up is the difference between hospice and palliative care, because palliative care is not hospice. They have a lot of things in common. They are both interdisciplinary teams that include a physician, an advanced practice nurse or PA or nurse practitioner, a palliative care trained social worker, a palliative care trained chaplain, and often somewhere in the back room is a palliative care trained clinical pharmacist. I say palliative care, go early, go often. If you get diagnosed with a major illness, chronic, terminal, or otherwise, ask for a palliative care consult right away. If the professional tells you, oh, no, it's too early for a palliative care consult, then you have someone who really doesn't understand the difference between palliative care and hospice, because it is never too early for palliative care. End of life is the one healthcare issue that every single patient of any doctor or nurse will face. And yet it is the one issue that med school and nursing school and all the training doesn't touch.
Has that changed? Is it moving in the right direction at least?
I think ever so slowly and
Mm,
incrementally it is moving, it's moving not so much within healthcare, but because of a movement called death positivity, which says, why aren't we talking about this thing? Why are we leaving the most important thing in our lives and in the lives of our loved ones up to chance? Why are we doing that?
mm.
And so death positivity says, hey, let's just talk about this. Let's look at it in a different light. Let's look at it in a real light. Let's look at it in a positive light. Some death positive people are looking at it humorously. Whatever it takes, let's look at it. Let's talk about it, because it is going to happen to every single one of us.
And we're still normalizing the conversation to be one that people can have without saying, there's always time to talk about that later. I don't want to think about that now.
Right.
The figures that you referenced just in conversation now, but also in Care Boss about the amount of time that people are on hospice care, and particularly with regards to a cancer diagnosis, those ones are pretty shocking, just how short the average is. And in fact, it sounds like um, Bob felt like he knew everything. And you mention in the book that when he finally decided that he was ready for hospice, I mean, it was what, 10 or 12 days away
Right.
from.
E Exactly. Bob was no exception. The decision, especially in my opinion, especially in cancer, the decision to transition to hospice status, and remembering for your listeners, hospice is not necessarily a place. Hospice care is most often provided wherever the patient lives or is able to be cared for. So maybe they move into a relative's home. Maybe it's in a nursing home, maybe it's in their own home, but hospice is a status of healthcare, not necessarily a place. There are inpatient hospices, but those are very infrequently used. But the transition to hospice status, especially in cancer, is just a really tough one. And this comes, I think, a lot from our societal notion of what I call the war language on cancer. So we will fight it. So and so lost his battle with. This is a misnomer of great proportion, if you ask me, to utilize sports and war language with an illness like cancer is a big mistake. It is so much more than that binary win or lose situation. And my husband died of cancer, and I can tell you right now, he was not a loser. There was nothing about him that was
Mhm.
over there. He was an incredible man and led an incredible life and had a peaceful and dignified death. And there is nothing about that is loser material. So it's a mistake, I think, to set things up that way, but it does happen. And I really think that it's important to start out with the question of what am I really looking for the rest of my life in terms of quality, and what do I want the rest of my life to look like now with this diagnosis? And at what point are the side effects from treatments or the disease itself infringing upon just getting good time, precious time with family and friends and loved ones so that I can say my goodbyes, I can enjoy my time. Um, we can focus on just comfort and dignity and whatever it is you need to complete your life. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but I feel like, with podcasts like this, if we start talking about it before we get ill, if we start normalizing discussion about end of life, that's a really positive move, because I can tell you from experience that it gets a lot harder to have those conversations after someone gets a diagnosis. They're still important, but they are more difficult when someone gets sick. It's incredibly helpful after someone gets sick to have had previous conversations when everyone was well. I wanted every possible treatment, or I didn't want every possible treatment in the abstract. Now that we're into the reality, I'm balancing what I want and what I don't want. And we're sorting that through as we go. And it is super important to keep those lines of communication open.
And to create those records, right? So that,
Absolutely.
there is something to refer back to. On the page of the book that has the photo that I'm guessing are Bob's folks, that says "Eat lots of fish" on it. Um, it talks about how his parents had very, very different approaches and opinions about how they wanted, their ends to come, and it sounded like one of them wanted every last heroic effort to be made to keep them as alive for as long as possible, and the other was sort of the opposite end of that, and wanted only to be around for as long as they had quality of life. And that page makes the point of the right choice for a person is their own choice.
Absolutely. It was wonderful for Bob to have this example within his own family. His parents both lived into their 90s, and they were very different. His father said, "The minute I start showing cognitive decline, you keep me comfortable until I die. I don't want to extend anything." And his mother was the polar opposite, every life extending measure. This is entirely how we are in the United States. So in 2013, Pew Research did a study asking the question, if you had a disease with no hope of improvement, and then they offer three different scenarios: suffering a great deal of pain. 57% of people said, just keep me comfortable till I die. 35% said, every life extending measure. The second variation was, you have a disease, no hope of improvement, and the illness makes them totally dependent on somebody else. The gap closes. 52% say, just keep me comfortable till I die. 37% say, no, 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 I want every life extending measure. And then the final variation is that it was hard to function in day to day activities. And in that one, we have an absolute even split. 46% say, just keep me comfortable till I die. And 46% say, no, 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 I want every life extending measure. And this knows no cultural bounds, no ethnic bounds, no racial, right, bounds, familial bounds. Bob's parents are a perfect example of this. That your sister, who you have been close with forever, may have the absolute polar opposite idea of what she wants than what you want. And so this is essential to talk about. Essential. If you have a loved one who is 18 years or older, you need to have this conversation today. Absolutely today, because you don't know that if they're going to be in a motor vehicle accident, you don't know when someone's going to have a stroke, and you need to have that conversation so that you have an idea, should they be unable to make decisions for themselves, as to which end of that spectrum they were on.
Well, and my sister and I just on Friday got together with my folks for lunch and to go over their previously established advanced directives. And my father had actually changed his opinion from saying sort of every life sustaining method that can be done should be done, and no longer feels that way, is much more coming over to the side that the rest of my nuclear family is in, which is just quality versus quantity. And so in revisiting that, we were able to adjust what the expectations were and what the directives were, frankly.
Two excellent points. One, that your opinion can change about this, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, not only have the initial conversation, but periodically touch base. And Bob and I used to do that periodically, especially after he got sick. I would say, "You used to say this. Do you still feel that way?" And in his case, he said, "Yeah, I still feel that way." The
Mhm.
second thing you bring up that's important is this notion of quality, right? So that is quality. Whatever someone wants, that is their quality.
Mm.
So you can say quantity over quality, but the truth is that if I want every life extension measure, then that is what I consider to be high quality. So keep that in mind, because we always have to meet the person where they are if we're going to be effective in supporting their choices, their decisions, not ours.
That's a great point.
When it's our death, we'll do it our way. But for the case of the people that you care about, or in the case of healthcare professionals, always meeting the patient where they are and helping the rest of the family. If there's a difference, helping the rest of the family see that we need to be where the patient is.
I think that's a great point, Jennifer. Thank you for saying that, because I always think of the quantity versus quality thing to be pretty binary. It's one or the other, but I it's interesting to hear you say, well, the quantity, however it is, that is their quality, which
Right.
I hadn't really considered. So you have a page on anticipatory grief, which is a concept that I feel like a lot of people are familiar with, but maybe don't know the terminology. They've probably felt it, but don't know what exactly qualifies as anticipatory grief. Can you read the page that you have about that and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Anticipatory grief. Grieving before your loved one actually dies. It's real, it can be huge. In one study, 40% of widows reported anticipatory grief as worse than the grief after the death. I am suffering from anticipatory grief. The key is honoring my anticipatory grief while not allowing it to spoil the time we have left together.
How did that manifest itself for you and for your husband, Bob?
As I mentioned earlier, I had lost my brother at a young age, and my mother before I even met Bob. And I knew how utterly painful it was, the depths of grief. I knew how bad it was going to hurt when Bob died. Yeah, so actually, it was a friend of mine who I was describing to her, and she said, "Jennifer, that's anticipatory grief." And I looked it up, and all of a sudden, that was very helpful to name it and claim it and acknowledge it, honor it, but have it have its place and not let it spill over into ruining our precious time, our time we
Mhm.
had left together.
Sure. Another page that you have that I think is such a great one, such a powerful one, that has a picture of a mobile phone that says, "Our best friends in this are those who check in frequently yet have no expectations of a response, preferably by text message."
I think this is true in the caregiving space, and this is true for grievers as well. We get forgotten, caregivers, especially, both actually, just forgotten. So, as the friends trying to support the caregiver or griever, frequently our tendency is to say, "What can I do to help? Let me know what I can do to help." The problem with that is it really puts the onus on the caregiver or griever to try to determine what I need and then to tell you what I need. And I don't have it. I can't do it. I can't identify what I need. I certainly am not going to tell you what I need. And the other thing that happens is people think of the person who's sick a lot. "Oh, I better check in with Bob because he's dying." But they don't always think of the person who's taking care of the person who's dying. And then similarly with grief, there's usually a sort of a flood of activity and messages and notes and flowers and casseroles, and then it really dies off and this profound loneliness sets in. And I have a list myself of a number of caregivers and grievers in my life that I just once a week or so text them a little red heart, and it the message is simply, "I haven't forgotten you. I am sending you support and love. I'm here." And I have no expectation that they will respond. I sometimes tell people that at the beginning. "I'm just going to check in. I'm going to send you messages of support. Please don't feel like you have to respond." And I do that pretty regularly. And on the receiving end, in that caregiving and grieving space, it really is a godsend.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things that's going to be very personal. Some people will want to be told, "I am going to do this for you," or ask the question, "What can I do to help?" Which in your case you said was just not really very helpful. I know that in talking with my cousin about the loss of his son very tragically, and how completely the family unit changed after that, he said a lot about how they were blessed with a lot of very close friends and family. But he said that really just was an incredible shock, not only to them, but then all of their relationships. And some people didn't seem to know what to say and so didn't get in touch, or were there up through the funeral. And then when anniversaries rolled around, didn't really know how to deal with it, didn't know what to say or not to say. And so just kind of went quiet. And granted, they gained a lot of new friends during that process, but I think there was still sort of a shedding of people because maybe they didn't know how to address the awkwardness that comes particularly in Western society, where we're not having the conversations early and we don't know how to talk about it.
I think that's absolutely true, Kevin. I've had the experience before where, on, let's say, Bob's and my anniversary, that's a big day for me. And we all approach them most of the time knowingly. And I've had the experience one day, I can remember specifically, I went into a little gift shop that I love and was thinking of treating myself to something on my wedding anniversary with Bob. The owner and shopkeep is a friend of mine. And I said, "Today was our anniversary." And she got kind of, "Oh, sad, so sorry." And it's just like, yeah, I guess. I mean, of course it's sad. I would love to be celebrating my anniversary with Bob, but it's a day of love. So, I don't know. It's not downbeat. It's necessarily, it's hard. But I think that there's ways to be a little neutral about it. I think a lot of folks worry that if they bring up the person, that somehow they will be reminding us of our grief. But the truth is, we never forget. And we really want, most of us love to hear about our person who has died. We love to talk about our person or persons who have died. It's not a taboo topic. For some people, it's painful. So, there I would just say, if you're unsure, ask. I have a great memory of your mother. I'd love to share it with you if you're open to it, and let the person say, yeah, I'm open to it, or maybe another time. But absolutely important to talk about our loved ones. I live in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm not from here. And people ask me a lot, why do you stay? Why don't you move back home? I grew up in New Mexico, as I said earlier, and I spend some time there each year. And the reason I don't, at this point, the reason I stay in Little Rock is because my husband, my late husband, was a very popular and hardworking physician in this town. And it's a small town. And I will frequently have people approach me in the grocery or at a meeting, wherever, and say, can I tell you a story about your husband? Ah, it's lovely. It's just wonderful. The answer is always yes. I always want to hear stories about Bob. And I stay here because of that. And I frequently, I spend my summers in New Mexico because the people there knew my mom, my dad, and my brother, and will tell me about them. Yeah.
That's wonderful. As we said, it's probably person by person, and you're trying to read the room about what somebody needs. It's something I want to do a future Light at the End podcast on, is on behalf of the people who know they want to support the person that they care about, but frankly just don't know how to do it, or feel it's awkward,
Right.
don't know what to say, what not to say. So I think that's
Yeah.
definitely a subject for further
How
later
to
discussion.
be a better friend to a caregiver, or griever.
Exactly. Another page that I really was taken with was the one that said, I can't pull away. The regret after he dies will be unbearable. I want to know that I loved him thoroughly. That's my goal from now until he is gone. I'm wondering if you tried to keep that as a little bit of a mantra of sorts on the not so good days, of which you
Yeah.
indicate there were many.
There were many. There were many not so good days. It is not uncommon. I know I'm not alone in having moments and days when I wanted to run away. I don't have the statistics offhand, but there are significant statistics about divorces after a cancer diagnosis. And so what I would do to manage it was to play it out in my head. How is it going to feel if I run away and he dies, which he's going to die? How am I going to feel about myself after he dies and I have run away at some point? And the answer was terrible. I'm not sure I could live with myself. And so that was what kept me going. It was just a great honor to be there with him to his last breath. And it was also incredibly difficult, but moreover, it was an honor, and it was necessary, important, essential. When I would play it out in my head, I just couldn't leave. I couldn't run away.
You also said at one point, sometimes I wish I would be diagnosed with cancer and beat him to the finish line.
Yeah. I don't think I'm alone in that. Many cancer patients have talked about how isolating the diagnosis is, how that once they get the diagnosis, lots of folks disappear, friends
Hmm.
disappear, they don't know what to do, they don't know how to handle it, almost like you have the cooties or something like that, right? They kind of scatter. And a cancer diagnosis makes the patient feel very isolated. Bob certainly had this experience. And I can tell you there's one person who feels even more isolated, and that is the family caregiver, the primary person who is taking care of that person with cancer, because there are folks who think to themselves, Bob's got cancer. I should check in with him periodically. There are very few folks who think Jen's taking care of Bob. I should check in with her. It's just a thought that never comes to mind. And so every once in a while, I would feel that way. What would it be like if I got cancer and beat him to the finish line, kind of thing? Yeah.
Mm. So you intimate elsewhere that being a caregiver can feel like a full-time, thankless, unpaid job. That kind of leads into another page that I actually was hoping that you would read, where you say, I will not miss these things.
Right. Absolutely. I'm happy to read that page. I will not miss the sleepless nights filled with his relentless moaning, wheezing, and suffering. I will not miss trying yet failing to comfort him. I will not miss wrapping his swollen legs. I will not miss giving him injections. I will not miss changing the sheets in the middle of the night because of his night sweats. I will miss loving someone so much that I do all these things. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's sort of the crux of the family caregiver. It's exhausting, it's hard physically, mentally, emotionally. And there's nothing about it that is glorious or wonderful in terms of those tasks that we have to do. But the love, that's the why, the reason we do it is the other side of that, and keeps us going. Um, yeah, definitely.
Sure.
And when you're caregiving, it's good to keep in mind your future self occasionally. You lose yourself a lot with caregiving, but somehow, somewhere deep down, you have to keep in mind your future self. And how am I going to feel after he's gone? How am I going to feel about, again, back to precious time, how I handled our precious time?
And you talk a lot about both his death and your survivorship and planning for both of those things, trying to get your head around it. And I think that's part of the reason why this conversation, I feel, is so prescient, is that I think for myself and other people like me, it's a really good way to become familiarized with a difficult subject that you're eventually going to have to deal with, and probably multiple times.
Yeah, it's certainly easier to do when no one is sick. This is why I always encourage people to have these conversations anytime, and to keep having them. That's people talk about the conversation, which is, I think, is a misnomer. It's not a single conversation, it's many conversations. It's not an easy conversation when everyone's well. It is much more difficult when someone is ill or has a life limiting condition. It's much more difficult, but having had those previous conversations is such a great touch point. You can go back to, well, you used to talk about this. Are you still there, or are you somewhere else now on that topic? And very, very helpful to do it. I will say, as hard as it is one of the most loving and intimate things you can do with people you love, is to talk about their wishes, to commit to honoring their wishes up to and beyond their last breath. And then when they die and you carry out exactly what they wanted, it's a great demonstration of love and commitment to yourself, that you did it. You did exactly what you promised you would do. The biggest, hardest, most difficult thing you could have possibly encountered in your life. It is powerful. I am a much wiser and developed person than I was before I did this for each of the loved ones that I've done it for.
You have another page closer toward the end of the art journal that said the most helpful advice was hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Hope for the best and prepare for the worst is actually in the book twice, once toward the beginning and as you say, once at the end. As I mentioned, I've spent my entire career in healthcare, and I spent some time in hematology oncology department at a university in Chicago. And one of the cancer specialists used to say to patients at every visit, we hope for the best and we prepare for the worst. Now, some doctors switch that around and talk about hope for the best and prepare for the rest because they don't really love the whole worst thing. That's not what this guy did. I think it's important for many, many reasons. Lots of folks think that having conversations about end of life, especially when we have a life limiting diagnosis, is a hope killer. It is not. It is not a hope killer. We are fully capable, as the complex beings that we are, of doing both, of hoping and preparing. I would also say that the best and the worst change over time. When Bob was first diagnosed with a biopsy of a lump in his neck, they sent the specimen off to a very special lab in Houston to determine the genetic makeup of the cancer to see if there was in fact a targeted therapy available. So in those couple of weeks that it took to get those results back, the best was a cure, right? Why not? Why not him? And the worst was was death. And then when that came back and it wasn't the case, the best became good quality time together. The best became Bob's ability to work and serve patients and their families because that was most important to him. And so we went that way. We focused on that, and we prepared very thoroughly for his death and my survivorship. So hope for the best and prepare for the worst is absolutely essential. I would also say, in your relationship with the person, be cognizant of when they are in high hope mode and not trying to sort of bring in, here, sign these papers when somebody is in high hope mode, and not spoil that moment, but be sure to get around to signing those papers. When someone is pretty focused on getting some stuff prepared, let's not dilly dally in, talks of miracle cures and things like that. Try to honor where the other person is. That'll help a lot in doing this, in achieving the success of balancing both. It is simply never a waste of time to have discussions about end of life. It really isn't.
Yeah, one of the things, and I can't recall whether this was in this book or whether it was in Care Boss. It might have frankly been in both, where you say people tend to want to say, "Oh, well, you don't need to worry about that now." Well, let's just not, again, it's a little bit of a running theme that's kind of what our culture does. But you say on a couple of occasions, I think, we're okay with it. And trying to just say, let's move the conversation forward. If we're planning for a memorial or a celebration of life or something like that, don't tell me we won't need it, because we will need it. So
Yeah, everybody needs it, right?
yeah.
Everybody dies. Yes, that's actually a page in The Hospice Doctor's Widow. A few weeks before Bob died, he was planning his memorial service, which I was so grateful to him for doing because, you know, when he died, I just knew exactly what he wanted. I didn't have to stop and think, did he want this? Did he want that? Anyway, he called a cousin and said, I'm planning my memorial service. And the cousin said, "Oh, you're not going to need one of those." I could hear this person on the phone. They were so loud in saying it that I heard it just sitting in the room. He
Mm.
didn't have them on speaker. And I just thought to myself, wait a minute, we're all going to need one of those, right? Like, even if we're perfectly healthy, someday we're going to need a memorial service. Nobody gets out alive. So anyway, yes, that's a downfall. And same with the expression, we're at peace with it. We had put all of the cars and the property in my name, and the notary public, when we were going through the paperwork to do that, she said, "Why are y'all doing this?" And I said, "Well," and we were both sitting in her office, and I said, "Well, Bob's dying." And she got all squirmy and nervous and, kind of just halted. And I said, "We're at peace with it," which was for the most part true. I had heard Bob say that to other people. And moreover, I just wanted her to get on with the task at hand, right? This is not easy stuff. So,
Don't make
and
it more awkward.
yes, exactly. And that helped a lot. It helped sort of ease her. And it was true. At the end of life comes death. It's best to be at peace with that fact.
What was the thought process behind I am no one's number one?
Since Bob died and since the book came out, my father also died. And I don't have kids. I am what is referred to as a solo ager. There are a lot of us in the US. I am no one's number one. I used to be my dad's number one girl. I used to be my mom's number one girl, right? Because I was the only daughter. I certainly was my husband's number one. And I'm not. I'm not anybody's number one. I'm probably not in anyone's top 5 or 10 at this point. And that's okay. I mean, it's a fact. It's funny that you had that expression because I think that's true. I think that's an initial reaction. I don't talk about this a lot because I anticipate that people would react to that with something like, "Oh, you can be in our family. You can be my
Mhm.
number one," kind of stuff. And that kind of only makes you feel worse, right? It's taken the death of my father, which is what launched me into that solo ager, that no one's number one category. It is taking me some time to get my equilibrium there. I'm not going to lie. It is hard to be a solo ager, and anyone who's listening to this who is a solo ager, who has no obvious heirs, their people have died before them, or they are in estranged relationships. It's a difficult place to be, for sure, but it's a fact, and it's still important that we face some things that are ahead.
There's the page, perhaps you could read it, about any form that asks you for the emergency contact.
Sure. Any form that asks me for this emergency contact with a blank line, and grocery shopping still sets off some degree of grief and loss just about every time, even years later. So, in other words, the places one goes for help, care, and nourishment are risky for me. I am not alone in this. Other widows describe feeling the same way. This is a classic. You get that form at a new doctor's office or anything, any place that you are having to fill out an emergency contact after being widowed. It is a gut punch. It is a
Mm.
gut punch immediately after your loss. It is still years later very, very difficult to stare at that blank line, and it is hard as a solo ager. You have to have some conversations. You have to make some determinations as to who is your person, who's your healthcare proxy, who's your emergency contact, who's really going to be able to be there for you if and when you need it. And the grocery store is just rough. It just is. I don't know whether it's the fact that I used to shop for two and now I'm shopping for one. Certainly the grocery store that I continue to go to, that I went to when Bob was sick, it's certainly in that grocery store, but it kind of happens in almost any grocery store. Just because, breaking bread, right? Having community over a meal is just the thing we do with this person we love or these people we love. And it's gone. They're gone. And so, yeah, grocery stores are particularly difficult.
I've heard people say that about Costco as well, and whether it's their kids go off to college or something, and they go, "Oh, well, now we're not shopping for 3 or 4, we're shopping for 2." And
Yes.
then you really hear it again when people say, "I'm not shopping for 2, I'm shopping for 1, and it'll take me years to go through this amount of stuff that I've just picked up in this latest
Yes.
haul."
Solo agers, for the most part, do not have Costco memberships.
So the final page, and I don't know whether I'm giving something away with this. I hope not, but I love the fact that the art journal ends with an illustration and the caption, "Love is greater than death."
Right, right. Yeah. So death is greater, as we discussed earlier, death is greater than remission. Death is greater than a cure. Death is greater than a healthy lifestyle, right? Death is greater than the best specialist. But love is greater than death. The love goes on long after your person dies. Your love for them goes on, and in some cases, sometimes grows. And love is always greater than death. Death is greater than a lot, but love is always greater than death.
I think unless there's anything else you wanted to cover, I think that is a perfect way to wrap up this particular podcast. I love that sentiment, and I think it's a good send off.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing this incredibly personal experience and anecdotes and artistry and work that you've done. I really appreciate it. And I hope that everyone who's watching or listening to this will get something out of it as well. If people are interested in picking up a copy of either of those, is it best to do it at your website?
Sure. I I encourage people to pick up either book in whatever way you usually buy books. If it's at your local bookstore, you can order it through them. If it's Amazon, you can order it there. And there's a way to directly purchase it from the publisher on my website. I have a lot of resources on my website, on the resources page of my website. And so Jennifer A. O'Brien, OBRIEN.com is my website. And I really think that's the best place to land if you want to reach me, if you want to learn where I am on social media, if you want to buy the books, whatever it is that you want to do with regard to me, JenniferAO'Brien.com is the place to do it.
Wonderful. Well, then, thank you so much for today, and we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Kevin.
That concludes this episode of the lightattheend.com podcast. Before you go, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. To discuss anything we covered or didn't cover on this episode's topic, leave a comment for me or our guest. And if you have an idea for a future podcast episode or someone you'd like to connect us with, please get in touch with us for that as well. For more end-of-life topics, guides, and resources, visit lightattheend.com. And for those who wish to support what we're doing, visit us on Patreon. There will be a link in the show description and on our website. Until next time, take care of yourselves and those around you. Bye for now.